I wrote 200 films before sound came in.
Hello all, and welcome to Women Behind the Camera Class 4 Editors. This is going to be another long one, but I hope a fun one, so get set for some smash cuts. As you can see, our mise-en-scène here has been restored, so let's make that a vocabulary term, mise-en-scène. Mise-en-scène is literally French for everything in the frame and refers to everything in the frame. So as you can see, that also includes the background. Our background is back to normal and my husband is back behind the camera. So, before we begin, I am going to give you your attendance assignment for tonight's class, and it is as follows. Without looking it up, I want you to email me right now with the names of at least one male and one female editor that you can think of off the top of your head. If you can't think of any, that's okay. You won't lose any points. It's really, basically that's sort of the point. I want to see how many people in our class are even able to do this, what percentage of this little classroom sampling is even aware enough of the relatively hidden profession of film editing to be able to name any editors at all. So without looking it up, no cheating, this is science! Pause the video and email me with the names of at least one male and one female editor if you can, or tell me that you can't right now. Okay, you did it? Good. Now, we'll see if I'm right about this little presumption of mine or if I'm grossly underestimating everyone's vast filmic knowledge. But the truth is that in my experience, most people outside of the film industry or the field of cinema studies, and even some people within those fields, are surprisingly unaware of the profession of film editing, a phenomenon which we will be delving into throughout tonight's lesson as we go. Before we begin our main discussion, however, I wanted to comment on some of your hidden assignments from last week. First off, I realized belatedly that I had missed one of the main ideas that the book Pink Slipped: What Happened to Women in the Silent Film Industries put forth to explain why female directors were forced out of the industry during what I like to call the soft purge of 1920. I missed one, and the argument that I missed was one that I confess I had kind of dismissed almost immediately upon reading it and just totally forgot about it because it made little sense to me, and it seems to have struck many of you the same way. I found that the vast majority of you found the book's explanations in general to be dissatisfying, and I do agree. The argument that female silent film directors went the way of actresses and faded with age, to me, does absolutely nothing to explain the disappearance of female silent film directors at all, for a very wide variety of reasons that I would just like to touch upon briefly here. First of all, the very idea that women, actresses or otherwise, lose value as they age and mature is an inherently sexist construct created by patriarchal forces so as to inorganically keep women down when they enter their most powerful phase of life, the time after menopause, which was once regarded as a sacred status and still is in tribal cultures around the world. There's a very long story to be told here, and I admit to being a bit of a primalist at heart. Briefly, it goes back to the Middle Ages when the gathering patriarchal authority of the Catholic Church attempted to discredit the elder matriarchs and wise women of multiple different tribes all around pre-Christian Europe, labeling them witches in an effort to take power away from the, post-menopausal matriarchs who tended to be the eldest surviving members of any given tribe, because women biologically tend to live longer than men, especially in ancient times, so this was quite common. And this had, the women had sort of a sacred status of authority among their people, and deposing these women and imposing a male-centric authority to be controlled by the Christian Church was part of the story of the spread of early Christianity that they don't like to tell you in Sunday school, and it is, of course, part of how we got where we are today in terms of our current mainstream sexist culture. So, that said, The very idea that women fade with age but men somehow don't is inherently false and a double standard that is not natural to our species, being culturally imposed by, like a Bronze Age era patriarchal construct. Anyway, even if we are to agree with the unfortunate fact that in our current patriarchal society, female actors do in fact have more difficulty than their male counterparts finding work after roughly age 40, whether this is true or not and whether this is fair or not, it still does nothing to explain the issue of the disappearance of female silent film directors because A, unlike acting, directing is not a job where you show your face or your body at all, and B, there were plenty of young and beautiful starlets hanging out around Hollywood circa 1920 for a new generation of young and sexy female directors to have taken their place, if that was really the issue. The fact that, there were no young, beautiful women who took the place of the old guard who was allegedly fading, that fact alone, I think, sort of illustrates how this argument just makes no sense in the first place, and I think that fact sort of speaks for itself. Anyway, I'm sorry that I had failed to address that, but, maybe you can see why it slipped my mind. While I'm at it, I wanted to read from some of your hidden assignment answers that I thought were particularly well stated and worthy of highlighting and sharing with the class here just in case anybody missed it. Paraphrasing a bit, one student writes, "I think the idea that there is limited space and it must be filled by men is the biggest common thread. It's as if we've shrunk the world to half its potential in order to not threaten a population that has been socialized to believe that the rights of one group mean less rights for the winner group, which is so not true. You can't have a finite amount of an abstract thing. It's like putting a limit on morals, emotions, or thoughts. We see this fear manifest in a way that's meant to create a dependency on the winner population." That's the end of the quote. I think this is a very apt way of stating it, and sadly accurate to say that denying women an equal chance to excel in every field is literally shrinking the world to half its potential. Who knows how much progress we have already missed, how much we've already sacrificed so as not to threaten a population that has been wrongly socialized to believe that power must not be shared equally among equals. Like the memes say, rights aren't like pie. It's not like there will be less rights for men if women are treated equally. And honestly, even if it were like pie, which it's not, but even if it were, who the heck eats a whole pie by themselves? Share the pie! Another student made a fascinating metaphorical statement about the treatment of women who held down the home front in everything from piloting military planes to Major League Baseball after World War II. She writes, "You would think when they came back from the war they would be grateful and praise women for taking on and holding their positions while they were away. It's hiring someone to dog sit for you, and then when you get back from vacation, not paying them and deleting their number." This blew my mind because it's not only a great metaphor, but it had never even occurred to me that the men returning from World War II really did owe the women who held down the home front a tremendous amount of gratitude. The only reason there was a United States of America for them to return to was because of the women who kept the entire nation and all of its industries and facilities and services running while they were away. Looking at it in these terms, you kind of realize, what if the women hadn't been there? What if they hadn't done these things? First off, we'd have probably lost the war. And secondly, there would have been a massive economic and industrial deficit from the nation not doing anything. And honestly, it's the kind of disaster from which the United States would have probably never financially recovered. The fact that the culture acted like none of this was a big deal and, tried to deliberately erase women's contributions, labeling them, classified with the WASPs and everything like that, and that women should now concern themselves with having babies and getting back to the kitchen. This is all pretty insane. And it's even more upsetting when you think about the fact that most people, even feminist history nerds and scholars like me, never even think twice about it. This had never really occurred to me before. It's simply, just isn't something that is talked about. It's just like, oh, yay, the men came back and then they took everything back, the end. And it's not there's no discussion of like, oh yes, and there was a, you know, a parade to celebrate the women who held down the home front. No, nothing like that. And it's fascinating that we, you know, the historiography of this, I think, speaks volumes. So as a side note, you may want to go back and revisit your old hidden assignments on the discussion board. I often respond, I often comment on them, so, you know, go check and see if I left a comment for you. Maybe you'll learn something. So taking it back to the field of film editing for now, I'm going to read you a quote from the article Barbara McLean, Editing, Authorship, and the Equal Right to be the Best by J.E. Smith from 2017. It reads as follows. Although in the last few decades, journalists and reference books have claimed that only 8 women worked as editors in the studio era, there were a few more than that. As Editors Guild's records and studio newsletters reveal, now buckle up, here it comes, Carolyn Rees, Lucille Tanner, Sylvia Reed, Monica Collingwood, Hazel Marshall, Dorothy Spencer, Mary Stewart, Florence Leona Lindsay, Margaret Booth, Ida Jadaker, Laura Hayes, Virginia Boland, Marjorie Fowler, Verna McCurran, Iris Rainsberger, Virginia Lively Stone, Laura Jackson, Betty Lane, Layla Wetzel, Evelyn Kennedy, Irma Levine. This isn't even half of them. I'm just going to skip down to the bottom. This is what we're looking at. This huge list. Etc., etc., etc. And Alma McRory were some of McLaren's colleagues. Just some. In production meetings, on the set, and alone in the editing room, their decisions helped shape Golden Age Hollywood cinema. Traditional auteurists, be warned. Your faith in film authorship may rest on insecure ideological footing. And that's the end of the quote. It remains fascinating to me how this laundry list of just some of the names of female editors in the Hollywood studio era was ignored by scholars and historians for so long in favor of celebrating only the names of mostly the well-known male directors in both Hollywood and the field of cinema studies in general. The quote above comes from an article published in 2017, so understand that this is fairly new ground that we're covering here, which is crazy once you consider the fact that, you know, this information has been out there for over a century, and editing comes with an amount of creative storytelling power that is not only comparable to that of the director, but sometimes actually surpasses it in importance. To give you an idea of what I mean, let's take a look at a very apt and telling comedy bit by comedian Patton Oswalt on the topic of film editing.
We do need a woman president, though. Oh my fucking... I know that for a fact because of the way that I love movies. I love movies. And any movie that you love, chances are it was directed by a man, edited by a woman, which means a woman directed it. That's what that means. Literally, name a movie. I'm serious. Star Wars, Pulp Fiction, Jaws, Taxi Driver, Goodfellas, Lawrence of Arabia. Because that's how, look, those are the two. It's a dude with his camera dick just pointing it everywhere. I'm just shooting fucking film. Oh my God, just 18 miles of it. Look at this fucking, every frame is a painting. Oh my God, I'm making a masterpiece. Oh, fuck, I'm done. Yeah. Oh, fuck, I shot a lot of film. Oh, man. You see all that film I shot? Holy shit. Shot film everywhere, man. Oh, fuck. I'm a genius. I'm a genius. It's all me. I did it myself. Woo! And the woman's got to show up. We all done, sweetie? Okay. Out you go. I got to make a story out of this mess. No, we're not gonna release an 18-hour movie, sweetie. No. No. Go have a sandwich. Thank you. I gotta find the story here. That's how childbirth works. Same process. Dude's just shooting sperm. Oh, fuck. Every one of my goddamn sperm is so fucking important. Look at all the importance I'm filling you with. Every single sperm is a... Boom, there goes an architect. Boom, there goes a quarterback. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, my fucking God. You are so full of importance. Oh. You people mean the world to me. When he's done, his balls are empty, woman's got to come in. You all done, sweetie? Okay, out you go. I got to build a human life now. I got to make a nervous system and a spinal column and... Oh, no, but you helped. Oh, super job. Thank you. Good job. Out you go.
So, as Patton Oswalt points out, an extremely large number of the most famous, most successful, most critically acclaimed, and most important films in all of cinema history were edited by women. We'll be seeing just a small fraction of them today, of course, but it's nevertheless an interesting phenomenon. After the soft purge of female directors from out of the film industry circa 1920, a lot of women moved into the position of editors. There had always been female editors to begin with in the silent era. Don't get me wrong, it's not like all of the directors became editors. There had already been some, and obviously not every director became an editor, etc. But after the mass exodus of female directors from Hollywood, it does seem as though many women who still wanted to work behind the scenes in some capacity in the film industry shifted their ambitions towards editing and also screenwriting once directing was taken off the table. Which stands to reason, honestly, because editing is, again, a creative storytelling job, different from, but in many ways on par with that of directing, as is writing, like we'll be talking about in a week or so. It holds a lot of creative power and is a satisfying substitute for directing if a career in filmic storytelling is your goal. But don't take my word for it. As Senior Development and Production Executive at BFI Film Fund Lizzie Frankie explains, when women got pushed out of directing back in the late 1920s, parentheses, inaccurate, it was the early 1920s, but whatever, with the development of the studio system, editing, along with screenwriting, remained a field that women could flourish in. I think the perception prevailed that editing was like sewing. It was more akin to women's work. And that's the end of the quote. Interesting, right? Not only was it seen as women's work, but editing is also a post-production job. That's right, you remember post-production happening after the film is shot. Editing has a more behind-the-scenes quality, not taking place out in the open like the job of a film director, but happening in a private little room or editing booth far away from the public eye. And I personally suspect that this has something to do with why female editors were tolerated in such significantly greater numbers than female directors early on, and the same goes for screenwriters, as we will be discussing next class. The point is that they are out of the public view. Somebody who's driving past a film set, who might see a woman in riding pants and boots shouting "cut" through a megaphone, seeing a woman exerting a position of dominance and authority, and that would of course upset the patriarchal hierarchy. Even if editing is indeed as powerful of a role as directing, and sometimes, like I said, a more powerful role, editing happens in private and hence can be hidden more effectively from the public view. It is, ironically, this fact that editing happens in private that gives the editor arguably much more creative control over what they do as an individual. Their individual contributions are really much more their own than a director, whose contributions to film are inherently mingled with a myriad of other influences at the time of production, like what performances the specific actors are bringing to their roles, what shots the cinematographer plans, what sets and costumes and props are made by the various artists in those various departments, and so on. Editing, however, takes place in a much less chaotic, much more zen kind of environment where it's just you, the editor, the film, and the editing equipment alone together in a quiet little space where you can sculpt the story and the sequence of each shot perfectly timed and arranged to your own individual liking, literally having complete control over the unfolding of every single frame of film in a movie. So, obviously there's no one there to bother you, no one there to fuss you or tell you what to do, no one but you who has complete creative control over how the entire film rolls out. Maybe now is a good time to bring up a very important vocabulary term, the word editor. Editor. So like we've been talking about, a film editor is the person who does all of this, the person who takes the raw footage shot for a film, selects the specific individual shots that they want to keep, combines them into sequences, and those sequences together ultimately add up to a finished motion picture. Editing is both a creative and a technical job, and though largely digital now, was again originally once done with physical film. Here's an example of a 16mm film that I wrote, directed, shot, and edited, so you might say auteured, when I was an undergraduate student at NYU's film program back when they had a mandatory 16mm film class called Sight and Sound Film. Now this part where you see the first edit, that's the part that I want to talk to you about right now.
So can you see how right here there's a close-up of a man in a hat, and then after that there's a long shot? These are two different pieces of film that I joined together with a piece of tape right there. I'm only now realizing what a perfect splice this is. I was apparently a much, much better 16mm editor than I realized. This, obviously these are two shots taken at two different times, different camera setups, but you join them together with a little piece of tape on both sides, perfectly lined up with the sprocket holes. Man, I did it so seamlessly you can't even see the tape. But that's what makes it work, what makes it change shots when you run this through a projector.
These are two separate pieces of film that I cut. So I decided where this shot felt too long, and I had a razor blade, and I physically cut it, which is where we get the word cut, and we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. And I cut the beginning of the other shot that I felt wasn't exposed properly, and I joined them together with this tape on a little splicer device like what you are watching right now, because I have edited this in more ways than one. Basically, this is how you edit an analog film. You have a strip of film, you take a blade, like a razor blade, or like a splicer mounted blade, or a pair of actual scissors, and you literally cut the film. You chop out the frames that you don't want before and after each shot. Usually you throw out the footage where the actors are getting ready before they perform, and usually whatever happens right after, the awkward boil down footage when they're done. These are the things that we cut out to maintain that Hollywood illusion of high octane constant energy. So that's what they mean when they say something ended up on the cutting room floor. It's a bit of a misnomer, because obviously editors in the past had trash bins. They didn't just throw things on the floor. They weren't slobs. But, the cutting room, the editing room where you cut, it's actually kind of reveals what a very, very old phrase that is, because at the very dawn of cinema, editors were called cutters before it was really a respected job, and as we'll be talking about more later, it was only later were they referred to as editors, still within the silent era. So the cutting room is actually that's a really antique term that we have inherited, basically this is where we get the word cut, and I promised you before it would be a vocabulary term, and guess what? Cut is a vocabulary term. When the director calls cut, that's generally understood to mean turn off the camera, but the term actually literally refers to the editor's action of physically cutting out the unwanted frames that were just shot. Similarly, when you read a screenplay and you see phrases like cut to, or smash cut, or jump cut, all of these again refer to the classical analog film editor's task of physically cutting the footage with a blade or a pair of scissors, meaning that the writer of the screenplay is building in notes to the editor within the script of where to cut the footage and what they want them to cut to. Note that word, footage. This is again a term derived from an era when film was understood as a physical object like this, and footage does indeed refer to the length of a given film in terms of feet, in terms of actual feet. Like, obviously, films like even short films, films are miles and miles long, but that, is indeed yet another term that derives from the early silent era when they were measuring films in feet, and the work of an editor was very different from, and actually much harder than how I edited this film when I was an undergraduate student. Back in my day at NYU, we had the luxury of using the super advanced 1930s era technology of Steenbeck editing flatbeds. Whoa, so high tech, invented in 1931, it's the future! So, let me transport you for a moment into the NYU Post-Production Center as it once existed circa 2006 during my career as an undergraduate student there. A soothingly dark, serene room filled with Steenbeck editing flatbed machines as far as the eye could see, a dull, fat-looking little army of lethargic blue editing tables where you would go in with the footage that you just got back from the photo lab, hoping that your shots came out and that the Pac Lab technicians didn't accidentally ruin your footage by dumping your black and white reels into a color bath or some disaster like that, like they sometimes did. You would find an unoccupied Steenbeck and sit down and place your reel on the peg on the left side of the table, thread the film through the sprocketed spools, and attach it to the take-up reel on the right side. The Steenbeck only had one control. It was a single sliding stick switch that you would move right for forwards and left for backwards, and the machine would emit this soothing drone, like a meh. It's actually a really good impression of a Steenbeck. If you've ever used one, they sound exactly like that. Every time you clicked it left or right. You could feel the vibrations of the 1930s era motorized machinery humming and working within the flatbed, and the sounds of multiple Steenbecks droning on in this pleasantly dark little environment was a kind of white noise that was very relaxing and very soothing and very, very good for work. Though I never actually fell asleep in the Steenbeck lab myself, it would have been a great place to have taken a nap. There was a metal rack by each Steenbeck chair overhanging a trash bin for your outtakes. Like I said, no cutting room floor, there was, a trash bin. And on each rack were a bunch of these really tiny, thin little wire hooks springing off in rows and layers that were thin enough for you to thread the sprocket holes of a 16mm film shot onto to hang it up so you could keep your shots organized. These would vibrate like a harpsichord. They go like blung when you would pluck off a shot. You would first go through the entire reel of footage, click, and stop every time you saw the picture change. Like you saw, the close-up of the guy in the hat, and then suddenly it changes to a long shot, but there would be like some bad frames in between where you were getting the focus, or where like the camera, leaked in light. So you would cut those, you would notice them, oh, these are different takes, cut them beginning and end, hang them up, and that would be how you kept track of them. So you would have this device, these heavy metal splicers, which were about the size of a stapler, but weighed like as much as about 20 staplers. They weighed a ton. And they had these tiny little prongs on which you could thread the sprocket holes of your film to make sure that they lined up perfectly, that one take lined up perfectly with the next, as if it was one fluidly seamless piece of film, like you saw I apparently did so successfully. I did not remember being that good of a 16mm editor, but apparently I was very good at it. And it was important that you had to be good at it, because if you did not align those shots perfectly, if you laid the tape sloppily, even if you were like a couple of millimeters off and you blocked one of the sprocket holes, this is the kind of thing that creates a projector jam and would result in your film burning and melting when you projected it. So you had to be good at this. This was very important. And so this splicer, when you would line up these shots, it had like these little metal pads that would use to pat your shots down, and then a blade in the center for you to either cut them or ignore if you were taping them, and it would make this wonderful soothing like tap, tap, ka-chunk, tap, tap, ka-chunk. There was a really satisfying feel to this device. You could physically feel the film being separated or joined under your very fingertips. For those of you who have never done it before, I can tell you this: there is simply nothing like the satisfying sensation of editing a real physical analog film. It's like playing with blocks or playing with Legos, except that when you snap the pieces together, it doesn't build a structure, it builds a story, a motion picture experience that you can literally hold as a physical object in your hand. It's magic. Of course, like I said, I was using state-of-the-art 1930s technology, making the job much easier than what the female editors of the early silent era had to go through. Before Steenbecks, there were moviolas, the first machine used for motion picture editing. That is the subject of this humorous little clip from the movie Hail Caesar. Let's watch.
Oh, Monty, come join me on the divan. It seems Allegra's a no-show, which is simply a bore. But how...
I shouldn't wear scarves.
Now, moviolas, as you can see, were a machine built off of a sort of modified projector, a step closer to its ancestor, the electric sewing machine, and were thus a little bit more of a safety hazard than the slow and ponderous Steenbeck, which I see as more like an ancient land tortoise to the moviola's startled jackrabbit. The machines have very different personalities. But even the moviola wasn't invented until 1924, meaning that from the dawn of cinematic editing in the late 1890s up until the year 1924, there were over 2 decades of time in which film editing was done entirely by hand, without the aid of any machinery whatsoever. No motorized parts regulating the speed of your film, no built-in magnifying lenses with an electric light source so that you could see the film frames any larger than they actually were in your hand. Nothing. Film was edited by hand cranking a full reel of film onto another empty reel and watching it with the naked eye as you went. There was originally no way to regulate the speed of the shot because you were cranking by hand, and indeed early on even cameras and projectors were originally cranked by hand as well. So there was initially no way to know if the speed that you were cranking at would match the speed at which the film would eventually be shown and projected. So how did editors go about timing their shots under these circumstances? That's super important. It's a crucial part of making sure a scene has the right energy, that the shot doesn't lag or fly by too fast and you'll miss it. How could you get the timing right under these circumstances? It sounds impossible, right? Well, to answer that question, let's turn our attention for a moment to Margaret Booth, one of the most important film editors in cinema history. Margaret Booth began her career in the early silent era and is quoted in multiple sources as having said the following: "Before we had moviolas for editing, we would run the pieces of film through our fingers. I would count as if I were counting music to give the scene the right tempo. It was very tedious work. Close-ups of Lillian Gish in Orphans of the Storm would go on for miles, and they'd be very similar. I used to count to get the rhythm." Can you imagine the amount of skill that this would take? Editing film entirely by hand, not only without digital technology, not only without an Avid or whatever they had in between, but without even a magnifying lens, without even an analog motor to regulate the film's speed as you viewed the scenes. Doing the work entirely by instinct, entirely by feeling, developing a method of counting music in your head to match the emotional tempo of each shot so that you could know when to cut, and to have your work come out so effectively on screen in spite of all these disadvantages. The work of early silent film editors, the majority of whom were female, is something that I respect very, very deeply. Since we're talking about it, let's take a look at a clip from some of the editing work of Margaret Booth right now. As you can see, Margaret Booth was an editor in what is now called the invisible editing style, meaning that her edits are made in a fluid manner meant to serve the unfolding of the story as if from the perspective of an omniscient but invisible bystander, the camera, in a way that is so fluidly similar to human thought and perception as to feel as if it were invisible, as if the editing weren't even there. As a matter of fact, Margaret Booth was one of the first film editors to work in this style and helped shape the, very concept of Hollywood narrative continuity film editing, which we'll be talking about later, into what we know it to be today. The reason why films today are edited the way that they are in Hollywood and around much of the world is very much thanks to Margaret Booth and her contemporaries, many of whom, again, were also women. Margaret Booth began her career circa 1915, unfortunately with D.W. Griffith, though she did not work on The Birth of a Nation, thankfully, and lasted all the way up from 1915 until the mid-1980s, when she retired in old age with an honorary Oscar for 62 years of exceptionally distinguished service to the motion picture industry as a film editor. Booth was in fact one of the first people ever to be called a film editor, a turn of phrase coined by MGM production supervisor Irving Thalberg in the 1920s, whose new term for what had up to then simply been called film cutter was meant to better acknowledge the creative contributions that film editors make to a film, a sort of way of elevating the status of that in the public perception to what it really ought to have been in the first place. That's another interesting aspect of this story, as we touched on before. Early on in the silent era, it was believed that editing was not a creative task and was hence simply called cutting. It was seen as a form of menial labor, again, a mindless craft skill, like sewing, and not anything that had any actual creativity or storytelling control involved with it. Needless to say, this idea is wrong, both in the case of film editing and also obviously in the case of sewing. Both are highly creative tasks that, unless you're simply following someone else's pre-made pattern in either field, they both actually do involve a whole lot of creative choice making and control. For much of the classical Hollywood period, most directors were largely totally uninvolved with the editing of their films, which was handled separately by the predominantly female editing departments of most major film studios, meaning that female editors had a huge amount of control, often much more than you might expect, and yet unfortunately in the early days many of them went uncredited, and even to this day they remain a group largely neglected and underexplored by most historians and scholars in the field of cinema studies. According to the fabulous Edited By website that your reading this week was discussing, Margaret Booth became one of the most powerful figures at MGM Studios through her position as the supervising editor. Note that the supervising editor at MGM, the top #1 film studio throughout the entire classical Hollywood period, that person was a woman. That's a very significant position of power and control. A position that she held until 1969. Booth controlled the dailies of every film the studio made and had the power to order reshoots. She would frequently intervene with directors, writing new scenes when she found story problems during her nightly views of their rushes. That's the end of the quote. Funny how most people have never heard of her though, right? As I said before, editing is a much more obscure, much less celebrated position than that of director, even though it is at least as important as directing itself, and in cases like Margaret Booth can actually trump the director, ordering reshoots and writing new scenes. This is an incredibly powerful creative position. So the editing profession, as we know, was dominated by women throughout the classical studio era. Nobody shut them down, and there was no soft purge of female editors like there was of directors in 1920 until much later, circa 1940, a story that we will be explaining more as we go, so stay tuned. And it really does seem to be the case that the reason why female editors were allowed to stay while female directors were not has to do with this much less visible, much more behind-the-scenes nature of the editing process. Here are some relevant quotes gathered from the Women Film Pioneers Project article, Cutting Women. Pretty clever title. In 1926, the Los Angeles Times informed readers that one of the most important positions in the motion picture industry is held almost entirely by women, whose job it was to assemble thousands of feet of film so that it tells an interesting story in the most straightforward manner. Frank Woods of Moving Picture World states in 1917, "The finishing of pictures, the cutting and titling, has been, until quite lately, the most neglected branch of motion picture production. Nobody, with one or two conspicuous exceptions, paid any attention to it. It was a case of, let Jackie cut the picture and Lizzie, the typewriter, title it." Now that quote above notes that the intertitles of silent films were also largely written by women, a pretty significant part of a film that has no sync sound. So anyway, getting back on track, Florence Osborne wrote in a 1925 Motion Picture Magazine article, "Among the greatest cutters and film editors are women. They are quick and resourceful. They are also ingenious in their work and usually have a strong sense of what the public wants to see. They can sit in a stuffy cutting room and see themselves looking at the picture before an audience." That's the end of those quotes. It's interesting to see all these sources from about a century ago celebrating the field of editing and calling it largely ignored until recently, a sort of weird echoing of its current status 100 years later. Largely ignored until recently. Literally, that first article that I read to you with that laundry list of names, that was from 2017. We just, heard a quote from 1917, a perfect century prior, saying nearly the same thing. It's as if the larger culture has had a sort of weird historiographical amnesia about the existence of female film editors, as if it's a narrative that has had to swim upstream to fight against an overwhelming current of patriarchal assumptions in order to be heard then as now, and while not technically new in terms of film magazine literature as you just saw, still relatively new in terms of the focus of the field of cinema studies and other scholarship. But while female film editors predominated in Hollywood throughout most of the classical period, that is, from the start of the 1920s up until the 1940s, today only about 23% of the top-grossing Hollywood films are edited by women. That's still more than twice the percentage directed by women today, don't get me wrong, but it nevertheless illustrates a suspiciously similar story trajectory to the soft purging of female directors, the erasure and replacement of women from a previously predominantly female field that is now somehow predominantly male. So what happened? Editing departments at the Big Five studios used to be predominantly female. During the silent era and even into the 1940s, editing continued to be viewed to varying degrees as like sewing, even long after this idea was no longer being applied to film directing. And for decades upon decades in the distant past, women predominated in the editing field where they are now relatively scarce, with over 70% of the editing jobs going to men. As the Women Film Pioneers Project article on Margaret Booth states, despite the continued prominence of these pioneering film cutters, in 1940 the Los Angeles Times declared, "Lady film cutters a vanishing profession." Although these and other women would continue to play an important role in shaping Hollywood film, entry-level positions were now going to men more often than to women, and it would become increasingly difficult for women to work their way into the studio's editing rooms. That's the end of the quote. But why? Why would that be? Well, maybe this quote from Anne V. Coates, the woman who edited Lawrence of Arabia, is telling. She states, "When I first came into the industry in England in 1947, there were quite a lot of women editors, and then slowly they fell by the wayside. When I left in 1986 to work in the USA, I think there was only one other woman doing big features in England. But I was taught, or I must have heard it somewhere, that as it became a more important job, men started to get in on it. When it was just a background job, they let the women do it. But when people realized how interesting and creative editing could be, then the men elbowed the women out of the way and kind of took over." There you have it from film editor Anne V. Coates herself. From the horse's mouth, so to speak, a narrative that echoes what we have been talking about happening to female directors, and which, as you will see in an upcoming class episode, also echoes the story of what happened to female television producers and others to come, so look forward to that in a couple of weeks. But it's for these reasons that I suspect that my ideas about women's removal and erasure as directors from the silent film industries are relatively plausible and reasonably backed up by the consistent recurring parallel narratives that seem to underlie the very concept of historical and filmic patriarchy in the United States as around the globe. So once again, there was initially that belief that filmmaking was somehow like sewing, and along with the understanding of a camera's operating mechanism resembling the sewing machine designs off of which they were based, there was this belief in the silent era that the practice of cutting, what we now refer to in a more grandiose sense as film editing, was somehow akin to garment making, whether you were cutting and joining pieces of fabric or pieces of film, hence the kind of fine detailed craft work that women were expected to be good at, but which initially was not highly respected. That's the key. And don't get me wrong, I do actually agree that women might have a certain real-life physical advantage when it comes to the task of analog film editing. Having smaller hands definitely enables you to be more dexterous and better able at doing fine detailed work, like both sewing and analog film editing. These things, both require similar motor skills of, the type that would make you better able to join tiny film cuts in a way that wouldn't cause them to ever separate, rip apart, or burn in a projector if you were sloppy and misapplied the glue or the editing tape in a way that covered a sprocket hole. Trust me, I used to run projection for the NYU 16mm classes, so I have seen some bad cuts in my time, some badly done edits. Film smoking like burning plastic from bad cuts, too thick with too much tape getting jammed in the projector gate, film melting because the tape wasn't perfectly placed around the sprocket holes and caused a jam, film snapping apart at the seams and shooting all over the projection booth like BANG! Like, you never forget that sound. It's like a gunshot. Oh my god. Basically, you know, unless you tape both sides with the sprocket holes lined up to perfection, the projector will literally destroy your film. It will literally rip it apart, burn it, or melt the frames. They are gone. Your frames will be gone forever because it's, you know, it's a molecular reaction with light trapped into a physical object. It's not something that you can, you know, save on a disc or anything like that. It's physical. It melts away. It burns away. It's gone. You don't have them, and they can never be played again in your movie. So being careful, detail-oriented, and highly precise with, you know, your technical skills, having smaller hands with finer motor control, all of these things are advantages that I do think, in general, women do seem to have over men when it comes to the physical act of film editing in this particular matter. Sorry to be a sexist, but it is true. I myself never made a bad cut with film in my life. I never had, you know, any projector disaster, never had a frame melt, never had a frame rip. I'm now, like, looking back on my old films, seeing why. I was apparently very, very good at placing my tape and you know, just being very, very careful with it. And yet my husband remembers his film breaking and melting in the projector because of imperfect cuts that he made, so there you have it. As a 16mm projectionist in my time, I do remember noticing that it was typically the male students who were much more likely to have made bad edits than the female students, usually because, you know, they were sloppy and thought they could get away with using only one layer of tape to save time, or just, you know, didn't really pay attention, thought it didn't matter. I remember one kid did a single tape layer in his entire film, causing his film to break about every 20 seconds, making for a very annoying viewing experience for the rest of the class, and doing permanent damage, irreparable damage to his footage. Anyway, the real art of editing, as my favorite film tech professor Arnold Basov used to say, is all about the juxtaposition. Arnold Basov had been taught editing by a Russian film professor whose teacher was actually Sergei Eisenstein himself, the famous Soviet film director who blazed trails in the world of montage, a term that we will be discussing more shortly. In the silent era in Russia, there were a lot of really fascinating filming experiments being done, perhaps the most interesting of which was called the Kuleshov effect. That's right, the Kuleshov effect. The Kuleshov effect is named for Soviet filmmaker Lev Kuleshov, and it's a mental phenomenon by which viewers derive more meaning from the interaction of two sequential shots than from a single shot in isolation. Kuleshov did a really interesting experiment that I like to think of as reverse shot soup. That's my little mnemonic device for it. In which he took footage of an actor with a neutral facial expression and edited it together, say that 3 times fast, edited it together, first with footage of a bowl of soup, then with footage of a child in a coffin, then with footage of a woman. Audiences who saw the footage reported believing that the actor's expression was different each time, that he was emoting hunger for the soup in the first shot, sorrow at the death of the child in the second, and lust over the woman in the third, even though the footage of the man's face was actually exactly the same in each take. Here's an abbreviated example of the Kuleshov effect sequence that I'll play here over my narration. This is not the original, but it is a very good recreation of it. As you can see, it is the juxtaposition of these shots that work together to tell the story, much more so than the actor's actual performance or the director's direction. It is in reality the editor who is telling the story here much more so than anyone else involved. even in a lot of Hollywood films, from, you know, both the past and the present day, this phenomenon is relied upon heavily by editors who often use B-roll footage and alternate takes to fix a disjointed or problematic filmic story with fluid editing coverage, as we will be seeing that Marcia Lucas did in order to save Star Wars in the edit later on, so stay tuned. So, in Russia, film has long been inspired by these early experiments with montage and editing juxtaposition, with Russian filmmaker Dziga Vertov being one of the most celebrated Russian film pioneers, credited with perfecting the montage, especially within his famous film from 1929, Man with a Movie Camera. One thing about this film, though, by far the most famous thing about it is its editing. And Dziga Vertov did not edit it. Everyone knows his name. Everyone associates his name with this film, calling him, you know, experimentally groundbreaking, phenomenal, sometimes even referring to Vertov as a genius. Hardly anyone knows that this film, a film again primarily famous for its editing, not its directing, was edited not by Vertov, but by his wife, Yelizaveta Svilova. Let's take a look at 1929's Man with the Movie Camera right now. just saw, Yelizaveta Svilova is shown editing the film that you are actively watching, illustrating the editing process itself, a super meta kind of moment, intercut with lots of other footage of Russian industry, including a noticeable amount of footage dedicated to women working, a kind of a feminist, inclusion of a lot of women's work in like things like a textile factory, and a cigarette box factory, all of these different things, and I think that the one in the thread factory really does sort of contribute to this conceptual linking of the connection between film editing and sewing, as well as other kinds of women's labor, as it was perceived at the time, and which I would say Svilova seems to be celebrating. I should mention, however, that this was, of course, a silent film, and that percussive musical score that you just heard was neither historically accurate nor original to the film. So if you dislike the music to a silent film, unlike in sound film, you can't blame the editor for that because they had nothing to do with it, assuming that the film would be scored by an orchestra or what have you when it was screened at a given theater. So before we leave the silent era completely behind, however, let's talk briefly about what we just saw. The entire film, Man with a Movie Camera, is a form of avant-garde montage. That's right, I told you. Montage. So, a montage is a kind of hodgepodge of shots, like what you just saw, sometimes illustrating a thematic point, like the famous newspaper spinning montages of classical Hollywood. Though in an avant-garde film like Man with a Movie Camera, it's just solely there for its own artistic sake. That whole movie, Man with a Movie Camera, is pretty much just a montage, the entire thing. That makes it an example of avant-garde cinema. Avant-garde. Yeah. So avant-garde is literally just the French term for vanguard or advance guard. In other words, something that's like so far ahead of its time. It really just refers to experimental, non-story film, non-narrative film, like what you just saw in Man with a Movie Camera. In other words, something that doesn't really make sense, maybe, or it doesn't make narrative sense. So basically, avant-garde cinema stands in opposition to the fluid Hollywood continuity style of invisible editing, which we will term from here on out continuity editing. Continuity editing. Continuity editing is basically the kind of editing found in most mainstream American and international film. In other words, normal, non-experimental editing. Let's now take a look at one of the films of Dorothy Arzner. You remember, we talked about before she was a director, she was an editor. She edited this film, of course, in the invisible continuity style for Paramount at the beginning of her career. The film Blood and Sand, which we talked about briefly last week, a film that she not only edited, combining footage of actor Rudolph Valentino with stock footage from actual bullfights, but also directed some of the coverage shots in the bullfighting arena in what would become her first foray into the world of film directing. Let's take a look at her editing work in 1922's Blood and Sand right now. Now keep in mind, what you just saw there was a film edited in 1922, meaning that it was done before the advent of the moviola, and therefore entirely without the aid of any machinery, entirely with the naked eye before any machinery for editing was invented, and Dorothy Arzner was simply looking at the film strips by hand and maybe counting like Margaret Booth as she rolled the footage from reel to reel with a hand crank. As someone who's been editing film on a variety of platforms, both analog and digital, since college, I can tell you that it is mind-blowing and insane that these early female editors were able to make any films that are even remotely watchable by editing in this way, let alone such compelling and dynamic narratives that unfold just as powerfully as if they were edited with modern technology, as opposed to by hand and with the naked eye, with no playback and no ability to run the footage to speed to even check it as they went. This is crazy. I hope you understand, this is crazy. And, you know, it implies a level of skill almost unimaginably advanced. You'd have to be in such ludicrous spiritual sync with the footage, the story, and the universe to achieve this stunning level of narrative fluidity while working basically with a blindfold on. It blows my mind. We'll get to Star Wars later, I promise, but not yet. For now, before we completely leave the topic of avant-garde film, I want to talk briefly about French New Wave cinema. I focused a lot on Hollywood last week, as I'm sure I will later on in this course, but now I'm making up for it a little bit here with some major international cinematic movements. What now? Unfortunately, they're mostly European, because those are the cinemas with the most mainstream scholarly study, and hence the most information written about them in English. Maybe someday that will change, but for now you got Russia and France, so better than nothing. Anyway, French New Wave cinema was a movement in France in the 50s and 60s in which experimentation and avant-garde techniques were in popular vogue. Perhaps the most significant aspect of French New Wave cinema and its, contributions to cinematic history is the innovative use of editing noticeable in these films. We all know the names of famous French New Wave auteurs, directors like Jean-Luc Godard and Francois Truffaut, all men, which is odd, honestly, given that these men did not edit their own films, very much like Dziga Vertov, and editing is really what makes these films interesting, groundbreaking, and unique. Of course, their most famous films were all edited by women. Cécile Decugy, if I'm saying that right, sorry, I don't speak French, Decugy, edited the 1960 film Breathless, Jean-Luc Godard's breakout work. Breathless is also one of the most famous and significant films of the French New Wave, especially in terms of popularizing the jump cut. Jump cut. A jump cut is an abrupt cut to only a slightly different position, like this! As you can see here in this clip from Breathless, the jump cut was what really made Godard's film stand out. Let's take a look at Breathless right now.
Regarde une Talbot, elle est belle, 2,5 litres.
Tu es un garçon.
Quoi?
Je ne sais pas.
Patricia, regarde-moi. C'est interdit d'aller voir Steve. Hélas, hélas, hélas. J'aime une fille qui a une très jolie nuque, de très jolis seins, une très jolie voix, de très jolis poignets, un très joli front, de très jolis genoux. Mais qui est lâche.
Now, this jump cut sequence was all the rage in its time and has been glorified and celebrated by cinema scholars who are into that kind of thing since the film came out in 1960. But the story behind it from Jean-Luc Godard's own writing is very unusual, very interesting. He states, "First films are always very long, since people try to put everything into their first film, and I was no exception to the rule. I had made a film that lasted 2.25 or 2.5 hours, and it was impossible. The contract specified that the running time not exceed an hour and a half. And I remember very clearly how I invented this famous way of cutting that is now used in commercials. We took all the shots and systematically cut out whatever could be cut while trying to maintain some rhythm." I'm just going to pause there and say, we? I thought he said I. No, he said we. What is he talking about? Anyway, for example, Belmondo and Seberg had a sequence in a car at a certain moment, and there was a shot of one, then a shot of the other as they spoke their lines. And when we came to this sequence, again, we, shifting from first person singular to first person plural, which had to be shortened like the others, instead of slightly shortening both, the editor and I, oh, there's an editor, flipped a coin. We said, instead of slightly shortening one and then slightly shortening the other and winding up with short little stories of both of them, we're going to cut out 4 minutes by eliminating one or the other altogether. Then we will simply join the remaining shots like that, as though it were a single shot. Then we drew lots as to whether it should be Belmondo or Seberg, and Seberg remained. Interesting, isn't it, how Godard fails to mention Cécile Decugy by name, calling her simply the editor after he talked about how I invented this, and seeming to take full credit by himself for something that, even according to his own description, they seem to have done and invented together. Cécile Decugy is almost certainly the one who did the actual editing work, even if Godard did help. Her hands would have been the hands that made the actual cutting and joining of the film, and it was probably her creative instincts that decided exactly where and on what specific frames to cut. And yet few people know her name, while Jean-Luc Godard is a famous name recognized in film cultures around the world and has been so for over half a century, even though he is not the person who did the thing that the film is famous for. See a pattern here? The truth is that it's hard to argue that editing isn't actually the single most important, most different, and most significantly innovative thing, not only about the film Breathless, but about the entire French New Wave movement in general. And yet it is the directors of these films, who are, of course, exclusively male, and not their female editors, who seem to be credited with everything about their films, including the editing, which they didn't do. See? This is why I don't like auteur theory. More on this later. Anyway, Decugy also edited Francois Truffaut's Shoot the Piano Player from 1960, the same year, and was part of the editorial department for his film The 400 Blows, 1959, which is my favorite film in the French New Wave. She also edited, directed, and wrote, aka auteured, the film Les Refugees from 1957, a document of conditions in Tunisia during the War of Independence. But before we leave the French New Wave completely behind, we would be remiss, of course, if we didn't also discuss Marie-Joséphine Yoyote, or maybe Yoyote, I don't speak French, I'm sorry, the first black editor in French cinema. She edited Francois Truffaut's The 400 Blows, as I said, my favorite French New Wave film, as well as Winged Migration, a bird documentary, and Microcosmos from 1996, among others, the latter of which is an unforgettable film from my childhood for which she won a César or Caesar Award for Best Editing. Let's take a look at perhaps the most memorable scene from Microcosmos right now. They made us watch that film twice in 2 separate field trips to the local art house screening zone when I was in 1st grade, so now I've passed the torch of trolling on to you. So there, Mrs. Murray, my 1st grade teacher.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
We'll get to Star Wars later, I promise. It's coming. Anyway, since we were talking about films of the 1960s, let's pop back over to Anne V. Coates, the female editor who gave her first-person testimony so helpfully about the men who elbowed women out of the way and kind of took over. Anne V. Coates has the distinction of having made what is arguably the single most famous edit in the history of film, the famous Match Cut from Lawrence of Arabia, a film which she edited in 1962. Let's take a look at Lawrence of Arabia right now.
Lawrence, only 2 kinds of creature get fun in the desert. Bedouins and gods, and you're neither. Take it from me. For ordinary men, it's a burning, fiery furnace.
No, Dryden. It's going to be fun.
It is recognized that you have a funny sense of fun.
Here you may drink. 1 cup.
You do not drink?
No.
I'll drink when you do.
I am Bedu.
According to an article on film site Vulture.com, in the years following Lawrence of Arabia, Coates explained that the match sequence, arguably the most famous cut in cinematic history, happened by accident. Originally, she intended for Peter O'Toole to dissolve into the flaming desert, but after an early screening of the movie, the film spattered with grease pencil marks, she decided that the direct cut packed a bigger punch. And she was right. That's the end of the quote. Sometimes being a true master of film editing means knowing when not to edit.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
Not yet, Star Wars. Just sit tight, not yet. Now at this point, I want to surprise you with the first half of your hidden assignment. I want you to reply to your previous email to me with the name of the woman that you are hoping to do your midterm project on, or with the admission that you haven't thought about it enough yet and you don't know. Have I gotcha? So pause the video and go do that right now. Okay, did it? Good. So, moving right along, and again, only covering the very tip of the iceberg when it comes to female editors in world cinema history, I think it's important to mention Dee Dee Allen, who edited such films as 1967's Bonnie and Clyde, 1975's Dog Day Afternoon, and Wonder Boys from the year 2000. Bonnie and Clyde bears the distinction of being the first film ever to use the then newly invented exploding blood capsule for gunshot wound effects, a technology that the film feels perhaps a bit overzealous about using to a modern viewer, but nonetheless, let's take a look at 1967's Bonnie and Clyde right now.
Good afternoon, this is the Barrel Gang. Now, if everybody will just take it easy, nobody will get hurt. Is that your money or the bank's?
Mine.
All right. You keep it then. Next time I'll aim a little lower. All right.
Take a good look, Pop. I'm Buck Barrel.
For the Barrel Boys! Happy birthday, hon!
There I was, staring square into the face of death. And all I can say is, they did right with me, and I'm bringing me a mess of flowers to their funeral.
Let's catch him anyway. I ain't gonna risk my life in Oklahoma.
Now, like most Hollywood Hollywood films, Bonnie and Clyde is another example of continuity editing, or invisible editing, as we talked about before. An interesting note that I want to bring up here is about how Dede Allen utilizes sound to cue the audience's emotions and guide the story's tonal trajectory and feel. The Barrow Gang enters the bank to almost complete silence, creating a sense of their professionalism as bank robbers, as well as an atmosphere thick with suspense. This suspense is then broken by the shrill, unnerving sound of the bank alarm that results in a sense of mounting panic, a panic that is soon followed by the happy-go-lucky sound of banjos playing while the Barrow Gang and the cops exchange gunfire, the gunfire being a deep, bassy, percussive sound that helps alleviate the tension of the shrill alarm that came straight before it and creates a satisfying soundscape to complement the thrilling visual story. Notice the montage in particular, the fast cutting of the car chase with the abrupt inserts of talking head interviews, the police officer bragging about his near brush with the Barrow Gang, followed by the gang shooting the siren off of the police car while Bonnie throws her head back and laughs, and then back to the man who says that he'll bring flowers to their funeral, and then the satisfying musical and conceptual wind down of the chase scene. It's a very complicated editing sequence right there, and yet it plays out so fluidly that you don't even sense what's going on, which is why I bring it up here. Though it's far from Dede Allen's only impressive work, it nevertheless stands, I think, as a fabulous example of the interweaving of music, sound effects, raw footage, and non-sequential editing that works together to create a consistently exciting feel and a powerfully fluid narrative illusion that guides your emotions effectively throughout the story. Though it's going back a bit in time, I want to talk for a moment about the changeover to sound editing circa 1927. Here's another quote from Margaret Booth in the article that I apparently keep liking to quote for you. The transition to sound presented a particular challenge to Booth and other cutters accustomed to working with silent film. Silent film gave cutters a fair amount of flexibility in selecting and juxtaposing footage. With the addition of a soundtrack, they lost that flexibility. As Booth explains the difference with silent film, you could throw the film around in any way. When you got the soundtrack, you had to be careful that it was always in sync. Not the least of Booth's worries, however, were the new experts, the men in the studio's effects department from RCA or from Western Electric, who interfered with the editing of early sound films. Decades later, Booth remained resentful of their interference, complaining that sound was their background and they knew everything. And they didn't know a damn thing, but they knew everything. That's the end of the quote. It's interesting to note that these apparently unpleasant male sound experts were not what drove women out of the editing business as sound came around in 1927, though I think it's clear that these male technicians were throwing their weight around and maybe looked down on the female editors. But, of course, female editors didn't begin their decline until the early 1940s. Before that happened, however, and right before it happened, we had one of my all-time favorite sync sound films edited by a woman, Blanche Sewell, who edited 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Let's take a look.
Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road.
Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow, 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 follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick, follow the yellow brick, follow the yellow brick road. You're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. You'll find he is a wizard, a whiz, if ever a whiz there was. If ever, oh, ever a whiz there was, the Wizard of Oz is one because of the wonderful things he does. You're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Now, an interesting thing that most people don't notice about The Wizard of Oz, the Munchkin Land sequences and many other musical crowd scenes are actually filmed MOS. A vocabulary term, MOS. MOS is the German acronym for mit Aussprechen, or without speech, meaning, a film sequence shot without sync sound, though the old Hollywood joke is that it means mit out sound with a German accent. In reality, when you see Judy Garland and the Munchkin extras dancing and shuffling, for all we know when they do this, when this was actually filmed, there was likely no music being played on set, and probably just either the director or the dance choreographer off-screen shouting 1, 2, 1, 2 as they did their dance steps. And, of course, leaving this for editor Blanche Sewell to later add in the studio chorus's recording of the song, which you look carefully, the Munchkins aren't actually singing, to play under the footage in time with the music, but basically making the dance and the music sync. Editors play, obviously, a vital role in crafting these kinds of filmic illusions, and once sound becomes a part of that illusion, it's yet another piece of power, yet another artist's tool, yet another color of paint on the palette, or perhaps its own entire spectrum, for the editor to use towards stitching the filmic story together. Oh, did I just make a sewing metaphor? Maybe it's true! Anyway, The Wizard of Oz was famously a huge disaster on set, with actors accidentally being poisoned, nearly suffocated, or permanently scarred by early toxic special effects makeup, pyrotechnic malfunctions nearly killing Margaret Hamilton and her stunt double in their roles as the Wicked Witch of the West, and a whirlwind of directors being hired, called off, and replaced for various different reasons, lending an unusually disjointed and chaotic element to the production. Though the footage does not survive, there were originally multiple deleted scenes from the film, including extra song and dance numbers, reprises, and a rumored frightening sequence in which the Wicked Witch makes good on her early threat to stuff a mattress with the Scarecrow and make a beehive out of the Tin Man. According to Wikipedia, the higher-ups in the studio had also wanted to cut Judy Garland's Somewhere Over the Rainbow song as well, feeling that it was too long, made the Kansas sequence drag, and degraded Judy Garland to show her singing in a barnyard. And despite this choice really being an editor's final call, the Wikipedia article credits directors Mervyn LeRoy, Victor Fleming, and uncredited associate producer Arthur Freed, 3 men, for fighting to keep it in and eventually winning. As a matter of fact, the entire post-production subheading on the Wikipedia page for The Wizard of Oz does not mention editor Blanche Sewell even once at the time of this recording, nor does her name appear anywhere on the entire page outside of the single blurb side credit edited by. Considering what a train wreck the production so famously was, and the fact that, Blanche Sewell edited this disaster into what has become the single most watched film in all of international cinematic history, you kind of think that maybe she deserves a little bit more than just a sideline blurb credit with absolutely zero mentioning of her name anywhere in the main article, especially in the post-production subsection about the film. Just saying. While we're still in 1939, let's move forward into 1947 with The Lady from Shanghai, edited by Viola Lawrence, known as the first female film cutter in Hollywood history, who started in the business way back in 1912. Not the first editor, but the first cutter. Let's watch The Lady from Shanghai right now.
Sing it for us again, Mama.
Please.
Why do you stand for that, Bessie? I'm quitting. Why don't you?
You heard him, Mr. Poet. I need the money.
Talk of money and murder. I must be insane. Or else all these people are lunatics.
That's why I can't leave. That poor little child he married. Somebody's got to take care of her.
Don't hold me, but if you hold me, don't take your arms away. Comes a change in weather, comes a change of heart, and who knows when the rain will start. So I beg you, please don't love me, but if you love me, then don't take your lips or your arms or your love
interesting thing about The Lady from Shanghai is that people talk about it in other films directed by Orson Welles as if Welles was some brilliant master director whose artistic vision was ruined by the studio machine trampling his genius works. Oh, alas! Except that in reality, everything I've ever read about this particular production makes it sound like it was an out-of-control disaster that Welles only entered into because he desperately needed the money, and that Welles himself regularly created shooting conditions out of sheer sloppiness that put the health, safety, and lives of the cast and crew in danger of everything from drowning to alligator attacks to infectious diseases carried by insect infestations in shooting locations he chose in Mexico because he didn't do his research and was dangerously uninformed. Welles is not the hero here, in my opinion. I've had the misfortune of working with directors like him, people who put everyone around them in danger but who happen to be able to get off really great shots. And these people are not good directors. By definition, people who do not work well with others, no matter how good looking the raw footage may end up, are not good directors because working well with others, and honestly, making sure nobody dies, but usually this goes without saying, is part of the job. Famously, as Wikipedia notes, when Viola Lawrence was assigned to The Lady from Shanghai, she reported to studio boss Harry Cohn that the footage was a jumbled mess. She also informed Cohn that Welles had not shot a single close-up. Welles reluctantly obeyed orders to add some. Following poorly received previews, the studio instructed Viola Lawrence to make drastic cuts over an hour of footage, shortening the film to 87 minutes. And that's the end of the quote. This editing decision seems to have been what saved the film and made it the engaging, suspenseful narrative that we know today. I'd also like to note that Viola Lawrence was, at the time, the supervising editor at Columbia, meaning that she had the authoritative pull to force Orson Welles to go back and shoot the missing close-ups under protest, which means she was in a real position of power to overrule the director like that. Viola Lawrence is known to have been particularly shocked at Welles's failure to include close-ups of the female lead, Rita Hayworth, and with good reason, I think, as aside from the famous funhouse mirror shooting sequence that we showed clips of in a previous class, the close-ups of Rita Hayworth as she sings that song are perhaps the most beautiful and most memorable part of the movie, and it still ranks as the #1 most effective application of cosmetic false eyelashes, having been glued to Hayworth's face one at a time, that I have ever seen in all my studies of cinematic history. Now, jumping back forward in time to where we left off before, let's talk about one of my all-time favorite movies from 1975. Psych! Jaws. Star Wars is from 1977. Get with the program. Now, as I've said before, Jaws was the movie that convinced Hollywood that their main film-going demographic was teenage boys and would be understood as such from there on out. That said, according to even current modern statistics, teenage boys actually do not make up the majority of the film-going audiences because 51% of the film-going audience is actually known to be female. This was understood prior to Jaws, and Hollywood films used to be made with a general audience in mind that was presumed to be majority adult and majority female leaning. But ever since Jaws was such a big blockbuster phenomenon at the box office, it seems to have become standard operating procedure in Hollywood to try and replicate its success by continuing to target the adolescent male demographic, hence resulting in all the tropes that you may recognize in modern Hollywood today that are meant to appeal to teenage boys. It's not a very reliable formula, and it's based on some wildly false assumptions. But that said, Jaws is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's incredibly well written, well acted, well directed, and well edited by Verna Fields. Let's take a look at Jaws right now.
Hey, Mike, I know you got a lot of problems downtown, but I've got a couple of problems at the house I wish you could take care of.
One, I've got some cats parking in front of the house. I can't get down to the office, and that garbage truck next to the office has got to be moved.
So what I need is a red zone. It's a simple thing you can take care of if you've done it before.
Honey, would you come here a minute,
okay?
please?
Good.
Are you okay?
Everything's fine. Yeah, fine. It's fine.
Listen, if the kids going in the water is worrying you,
No.
they can play out here on the beach.
All right, let them go.
cold. We know all about you, Chief. You don't go in the water at all, do you?
Some bad hat, Harry.
Chief Brody, you are uptight. Yes. Come on. That's it.
Pippet! 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 Come on, Pippet! Pippet!
This from the Edited By website. Spielberg's Jaws brought Verna Fields a level of recognition that was unique among film editors at the time. She received both an Oscar and an Eddie Award for Jaws. Within a year of the film's release in 1976, Fields was appointed Vice President for Feature Production at Universal Studios, making her one of the first women to enter upper-level management in the entertainment industry. I would add, since the Soft Purge of 1920. Here's a quote from Verna Fields herself. "I was the liaison with the studio for Steven Spielberg. When they thought of ditching the picture because the shark wasn't working, I told them, keep doing it, even if you need to use miniatures." Fields became an overnight success after winning the Oscar. "Steven told me it was because I had cut the first picture that was a monumental success in which you can really see the editing. And people discovered that it was a woman who edited Jaws." And that's the end of the quote. As you can tell from this quote, Fields was a major part of the reason why the movie Jaws even came out in the first place. Jaws was thought of as a high-risk venture from the beginning, in part because of its appeal to the then-thought small target demographic in the teenage male audience. Fields' contributions remain tremendous, and yet they ring to me as somewhat bittersweet. Fields was editing in the age of the new Hollywood after the classical studio era had ended, the age of the young film school directors like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, when female editors had become rare, and it's clear that Fields seems to see her own success as a form of trailblazing, having started in the industry after what we might call the second soft purge, the removal of female editors in the early 1940s, and thus having come from an editing environment no longer dominated by women. It's the same story of, oh, look at what progress women have made, when in reality it's a rewritten history that serves to cover up the regress of the present over the much more impressive inclusivity and progress of the past. Now, we finally come to the part of the discussion that we've all been waiting for, Star Wars, and how it was saved in the edit. Let's take a look at a fabulous YouTube video I found by that very title on this subject right now.
A long time ago, in San Anselmo, California. In February of 1977, George Lucas invited some of his closest friends to watch a rough cut of his new film, Star Wars. In attendance among a handful of people were Steven Spielberg and Brian De Palma. The response was not good. According to Spielberg, this is how De Palma reacted.
Well, Brian went off the deep end.
Well, makes no sense. Nonsense.
The film was in trouble. Sure, you can point at the superficial problems with a rough cut, such as placeholder VFX, stock footage, unfinished sound,
Bang! I want them alive!
and temp music. But we're not going to focus on those. No, the real issues were fundamental. The story, the scenes, the characters, the pacing.
No blasters! No blasters!
But the film was not beyond saving, because they say a film is written 3 times. First in the screenplay, next in production.
You can't win, Darth. If my blade should find its mark, you will cease to exist.
And finally, in the edit.
You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
The success of Star Wars was not inevitable. In fact, the way things were going, it was almost guaranteed to fail. It was only due to their laborious editorial process that Star Wars snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. So Lucas turned to his ingenious editing team, Richard Chew, Paul Hirsch, and arguably one of George's greatest collaborators, his wife at the time, Marcia Lucas. Their job was to rebuild a bloated first act, cut tons of unnecessary material,
Sir, the Greuters are losing power. All right.
create clarity, tension, and drama in places that had none, and restructure scenes and entire sequences to propel the story forward. Basically, they just had to start from scratch. In this video, we'll compare and contrast these changes from rough to final cut, using references from the script, recovered deleted scenes, and behind-the-scenes interviews in order to demonstrate just how powerful editing is as a storytelling tool. So without further ado, let's go back and examine how Star Wars was saved in the edit. Okay, last but not least, there's one more very large structural change that occurred in the edit, and that of course was the entire finale. This entire sequence is truly breathtaking, and it's a remarkable feat of editing. But it took a lot of work to get it there. As it was originally written and cut, the Battle of Yavin went something like this. Gold Leader does a pass, he gets destroyed. Then Red Leader does a run,
It's away!
just hits the surface. Then Luke does a run, and also fails. Then Luke does another run, and finally succeeds. Kaboom. Good job. But here's the big difference. In that version, the Death Star wasn't about to destroy the Rebel base. I'll say that again. The Death Star was not about to destroy the Rebel base. It was literally just sitting there, waiting to be blown up. This is where Marcia Lucas came in. The first thing she did was recut the trench run, basically from the ground up. This included removing Luke's first run, but also more importantly, incorporating the idea that the Death Star was about to blow up the Rebel base. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that every single piece of footage that has to do with this idea is being delivered with off-screen dialogue over inserts,
Death Star will be in range in 5 minutes.
or by reusing footage from other scenes.
Rebel base 1 minute and closing.
Like this shot here. I can safely assume that this was reused from the previous scene when they arrived at Alderaan.
We've entered the Alderaan system.
For a first-time viewer, you would never know the difference. And as Marcia Lucas puts it, it was all editorially manufactured. So why is this so important? Just think about it.
Rebel base in range.
You may fire when ready.
If there's no threat to the rebels, then there's no joy in the victory. Essentially, they just went and killed a bunch of people. Which they did, but now it's a fight for their own survival. So there you have it. Okay. The intent of this video was never to dwell on the fact that George Lucas went back and made changes to the original trilogy, because Star Wars fans are so hardcore that they've restored the theatrical versions themselves. And it was this version of the film that received the Academy Award for Best Editing.
The winners are Paul Hirsch, Marcia Lucas, and Richard Chew for Star Wars.
Along with Ben Burtt for his amazing sound design, ILM for their groundbreaking visual effects, and John Williams for his incredible original score. Every step of post-production on Star Wars reflected a revolutionary commitment to the craft. Every frame, every sound effect, every piece of dialogue.
Use the Force, Luke.
Was given an intense level of consideration. Looking at how they refined the film through relentless craftsmanship should be a lesson to us all. Do I think George Lucas made tons of unnecessary changes? Yes, I do. But for whatever reason, he's continued to go back and re-edit these films. He said, quote, "I really enjoy editing the most. It's the part I have the most control over. It's the part I can deal with the easiest. It's the part I can rely on the most to save things, for better or worse. Everyone has their ace in the hole. Mine's editing." End quote. And so, for better or worse, Star Wars was saved in the edit. However, I think George's ace in the hole was that he surrounded himself with an incredible team of people to work with, and for listening and collaborating with them to help refine his incredible vision.
So, as you can see, right there we have another case of a male auteur director kind of taking credit for the editing of the film, which he categorically did not do. Of particular interest to us here, of course, are the specific contributions of Marcia Lucas, for which I have another very interesting video to play for you, The Tragedy of Marcia Lucas. Let's watch.
If I told you Taxi Driver, A New Hope, and Return of the Jedi were all edited by women, would you be surprised by that? Well, what if I told you they were all edited by the same woman? Marcia Griffin met George Lucas in the late 60s, and the two were married by the beginning of the new Hollywood movement, when young filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, and of course, Lucas himself began changing cinema forever. It is a shame, then, that her great work has been forgotten, unlike the men she collaborated with. Marcia would serve as an assistant editor on Lucas's first film, THX 1138. The film would flop, and Marcia would later remind George that the film hadn't involved the audience emotionally. Marcia felt it was too cold, but George wanted to make abstract films. He believed manipulating an audience into caring was easy. To show he could make a film that engaged an audience emotionally, George would go on to make American Graffiti. Verna Fields would be brought on as head editor of Graffiti by the studio Universal Pictures, and Verna Fields was largely praised for the editing. Marcia's talents would be dismissed, the studio only bringing Verna on because they had assumed George was using his wife as a way of editing his own pictures for himself. Verna Fields would leave this picture after overseeing the assembly of the rough cut. The film at this time was still an hour too long, so George would instruct Marcia on how he had wanted the film cut. It turned into a disaster. American Graffiti being 4 different narratives weaved together made fine-tuning a cut of the film very difficult. Marcia would start again from scratch. Her cut would screen for test audiences, who ended up loving the film, but the studio had little faith in Lucas or his movie and would opt to trim it further before its release. American Graffiti would be a critical and commercial hit, and Marcia would be nominated for an Oscar for her work on the film. "I made it for you," Lucas would later tell her. Martin Scorsese would ask her to edit Alice Doesn't Live Here anymore, and during this time, George would lock himself away to finish the first draft of what would become Star Wars. Marcia would be instrumental in the structure of Star Wars, not only for the final editing she would do, but for her input during the writing of the screenplay. It was her idea to have Obi-Wan die during his duel with Darth Vader. Mark Hamill would recall, "She was really the warmth and heart of those films, a good person he could talk to and bounce ideas off of." Mark Hamill also notes in 2005 how her sensibilities influenced the content and structure of his first films. "I know for a fact that Marcia Lucas was responsible for convincing him to keep The Little Kiss for Luck before Carrie and I swing across the chasm in the first film. Oh, I don't like it. People laugh in the previews." She said, "George, they're laughing because it's so sweet and unexpected." And her influence was such that if she wanted to keep it, it was in. Marcia was one of the few people George listened to. She reeled him in, helped him compose the script, reminding him that there needs to be emotional through lines in the film. George would always lament his writing ability, saying, "I'm not a good writer. I don't feel I have a natural talent for it. When I sit down, I bleed on the page, and it's just awful." Marcia would help George compose the script, along with his friends, offering which scenes worked, which scenes didn't, which characters worked, which characters didn't. She was at once his harshest critic and his most ardent supporter. Marsha was not expected to edit Star Wars. She just finished editing Taxi Driver and was pregnant at the time. Tragically, she lost the baby. Meanwhile, the first edit of Star Wars was delivered. It's no secret that it was, at first, a terribly stilted film. There was no kinetic energy as envisioned, and George would fire his first editor, replacing him with Marsha. One of film's best-known anecdotes is thus: Star Wars was saved in the edit. Marsha's work on the film was magnificent and masterful, rebuilding the trench run and diverging wildly from the script in order to build tension and give the film its memorable climax. For her work, Marsha would win an Oscar, becoming the 6th woman to do so for her craft, the 5th being Verna Fields 2 years prior, who won for Jaws. Marsha would also help finish the edit of Scorsese's New York, New York, and then she would retreat from her career with the idea of settling down and starting a family. After the shoot for Empire Strikes Back, Marsha was heavily involved in helping Lucas set up Skywalker Ranch, and while offers poured in, to edit, to even direct, she was steadfast and standing by her husband's side, waiting for him to slow down so they could do what they had always intended to do, start a family. But Lucas would continue to work himself to near death, being hospitalized at least once for stress-induced chest pains. The shoot of Empire Strikes Back was stressful, and though Lucas didn't direct, he would watch the production disintegrate from afar. Lucas would recut Empire himself, and it's thought Marsha may have helped with this edit. George and Marsha would adopt a child, and Lawrence Kasdan was hired to finish writing Return of the Jedi. Lucas would claim Return of the Jedi would be his final big film, and after its release he would settle down to spend more time with his family and wife. But George's workaholic nature would not let him rest, and he was soon serving as a full-time second-unit director for Return of the Jedi. During this time, their marriage would suffer, and George's inability to get away from his work would create a distance between them. Marsha would lament, "It was a lot more fun getting here than being here." The distance in their marriage would grow wider. While George was shooting Return of the Jedi, Marsha oversaw the final constructions of Skywalker Ranch. She would meet and fall in love with a local artist. Though she would later marry him, Marsha stated that nothing had happened between the two while she was married to George. Whether George was aware of his marriage's state or not, it seems in a last-ditch effort to bring the two of them closer, George would hire Marsha to edit Return of the Jedi, a project for them to work on together to bring them closer, as if it was the days of old. But it was not enough to mend the wounds. Return of the Jedi closed out the Skywalker story for the time being, and was also the end of the Lucases. George and Marsha would divorce after 14 years of marriage. What would follow is a dark time for the two. George himself would recuse himself from public life and for a time was considered a recluse. Marsha would not work on another major motion picture after a producing credit in 1995. The divorce was ugly. George would lose nearly half his fortune and Marsha's name would be scrubbed from Star Wars. In documentaries concerning the trilogy and Lucas as a filmmaker, Marsha's name is rarely mentioned. She has become a background character, rarely often given credit for her work on the films, and perhaps it is George's penchant for re-editing the original films and creating new changes as a way of obscuring Marsha's work. The divorce left him bitter. George felt betrayed and Marsha neglected. When they were finishing Jedi, George told her he thought she was a pretty good editor. Marsha felt that may have been the only time during their marriage that he had complimented her. John Milius would muse, one of the greatest losses in cinema is that Marsha did not continue to edit or direct. I happen to agree.
So the story trajectory kind of echoes what we've seen before, doesn't it? A husband and wife filmmaking team, maybe, in which the wife is the one with the stronger filmic storytelling instincts, disintegrating when their marriage falls apart, much like what happened to Lois Weber and Alice Guy Blaché, with the husband continuing to work in the industry and rake in fame and success, taking credit for some of the significant achievements of the wife, while the wife ends up getting pushed to the margins and erased from history. This time we can see very directly because of the man's deliberate choice to do so. Incidentally, as the video stated, Marsha Lucas was also the supervising editor on Taxi Driver, as well as the editor of American Graffiti, and also made significant uncredited contributions to Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark, as we can see in this interview with Dwayne Dunham right here.
And remember Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Yes.
Marsha was the last person to see it. And the movie's over, and we're all patting one another on the back, Stephen and George and Michael Kahn, great editor. And all of a sudden Marsha says, "Say, fellas, I don't want to rain on your parade, but just one thing." And everybody goes, "What?
What happened to Marianne?"
Yes, that's what happened to the girl. And we go, "Oh my God, we left her tied to the stake."
We left her tied to the stick when all the Nazis get melted
That's
away
right.
and heads explode. And there had been a scene written in the script. There was a scene where they were in San Francisco and they were coming, and he was coming out of a meeting, and she's like, let's go get a drink. And they never shot it because they didn't think they needed it. I said, I don't want to leave Marianne on the stick.
Right.
We need to shoot that. So George went out and George shot the second unit scene.
San Francisco.
Of them coming down.
Yeah.
They shot it at the
City Hall right
City
there.
Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of.
Well,
the movie needed it.
It
needed
everybody
that little bit of
recognized
closure.
it in that moment. That it was. That's exactly the right note. It needs to be corrected.
So this is what I mean when I say I'm not such a big fan of auteur theory, especially when the so-called auteur is merely the director and nothing else. If you write, direct, and edit your own film, then sure, maybe it's fair to say that you're an auteur. But if all you did was direct, it is wrong to take credit for the editing if you didn't edit it, just as it's wrong to take credit for the writing if you didn't write it, or anything else. But Hollywood journalism and film scholarship have inherited this problematic tradition of crediting directors with the entire film, which, as you perhaps have noticed by now, is part of how public attention has historically been drawn away from female editors and other women behind the scenes in the film industry, and ultimately has contributed to their historical erasure. Even I, as a kid growing up and loving Star Wars, used to worship George Lucas like he was some kind of a filmic storytelling god. I had never even heard of Marsha Lucas until about a year ago. Knowing what I know now, and especially considering the Star Wars prequels, it's clear that George Lucas wasn't actually that good of a storyteller, not even that good of a writer, and a famously clumsy director. Most of what was great about his films seemed to have come from the fact that he surrounded himself with people more talented than he was, and listened to their instincts and let their contributions override his own. It's unfortunate that the surrounding media and culture really gave George Lucas sole credit for the entire film series for so long, especially when you take into consideration that it was really the other people, most of whom we've never even heard of, who really made the movie the cultural phenomenon that it is. That said, the more power that George Lucas got as a result of this mislaid credit, the more he stopped listening to others and started to kind of out himself as the awkward storyteller with bad instincts and an over-enthusiasm for CGI that he really is. Now, let's move on to some more modern films with Sally Menke, or maybe Menk. You know, let's point something out here. She edited a lot of really famous films, and I don't even know how to pronounce her name. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing the names of, so many of these editors correctly. And I think that that really speaks volumes about who is recorded and who is celebrated in our culture. Anyway, let's say Sally Menke for now, the Oscar-nominated editor of Pulp Fiction and Inglourious Basterds. I want to reread you a quote about Sally Menke from the article that you read for this week, Hidden Histories, The Story of Women Film Editors, because I feel that it bears repeating. Menke was hired by Tarantino to edit Reservoir Dogs because, as he once explained in an interview, he wanted a woman who would nurture both him and his movie rather than shove their agenda or win their battles with me. It is a telling statement that underscores both the gender-normative views that continue to prevail in Hollywood and the competitive masculinism that underpins the mythology of the auteur. That's the end of the quote. This, too, is yet another issue that I take with auteur theory. The idea that it's all about the lone man, blazing his trails and going against the grain, making highly individualistic creative decisions that are all about him. Whether he's the editor or the director, it's all about him and his creative vision.
So full of importance!
The few Hollywood editors to really be raised up and discussed as creative and important by filmic literature are all men. But when a woman does the exact same job in the exact same way, it's seen as her being motherly and nurturing. The article that you read for this week discussed how the language surrounding men and women in the film industry differs, especially how women are viewed more likely as collaborators, while men are more likely to be viewed as creative leaders, even when the jobs they do are exactly the same. We should recognize this for exactly what it is, a sexist devaluing of women's labor built into the presumptions and surrounding language of our filmic culture, historiography, and scholarship. Let's recognize Sally Mank for what she is, a fabulous editor whose creative choices made these movies what they are, period. To illustrate this, let's break my promise on the syllabus, and instead of showing you the trailer to Pulp Fiction, which she also edited, let's move into the modern era with a look at a brief clip from another film that Sally Mank edited, 2009's Inglourious Basterds.
10 hot! I'm putting together a special team. We're gonna be doing one thing and one thing only. Killing Nazis. Sound good? Yes, sir! I'm gonna assume you know who we are.
Everybody in the German army's heard of you.
You probably heard we ain't in the prisoner-taking business. We in the killing Nazi business. And cousin, business is booming. If you ever wanna eat a sauerkraut sandwich again, take your wiener schnitzel they can finger and point out on this map what I want to know.
I respectfully refuse.
Hey, Donnie! Guy's German here wants to die for country. Oblige him.
An American Secret Service outfit lives deep behind enemy lines. The Germans call them the Bastards. These Yanks have been them the devil.
Well, we're all tickled to hear you say that.
The Germans are throwing a gala premiere. In attendance will be most of the German High Command. You'll rendezvous with our double agent. She'll take it from there.
You're getting us in that premiere.
It's suicide.
What else we gonna do? Go home?
So what's the plan? We punch those goons out, take their machine guns, and burst in there blasting.
Is that the plan?
That's about it. Or not.
There's something you don't know. Hitler is attending the premiere.
Getting a whack Uncle Adolf makes us a horse of different color.
We have all our rotten eggs in one basket. The objective of the operation, blow up the basket.
I'm gonna give you a little something you can't take off.
You're getting pretty good at that. You're now in the hands of the SS. My hands, to be exact. 99999.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
So as you can see, just like with Jaws, some of the manliest movies out there were put together by female film editors. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is, of course, the work of Thelma Schoonmaker, Martin Scorsese's longtime editor, who, of course, edited 1980's Raging Bull, 2005's The Aviator, 2006's The Departed, and many others, although all of those three had earned her Academy Awards for her editing, as well as 2013's The Wolf of Wall Street and The Irishman from last year. This is nothing new. Like we covered in our first lecture, even 1939's Stagecoach was co-edited by Dorothy Spencer, and its status as a Western directed by John Ford places it in the category of being one of the manliest movies of its time. It's interesting to me that the editing profession has become predominantly male since the 1940s, especially when you consider the argument put forth in the Pink Slipped book that male directors were able to learn women's storytelling techniques so as to replace them and make the women redundant. I would argue that here we're seeing clear evidence that since at least the 1930s, and almost certainly even earlier, female editors have been demonstrating the capacity to edit some of the most badass and manly movies ever made. And yet, rather than replacing male editors by making them redundant somehow, the reverse has happened and women now make up only 23% of the editing profession in Hollywood, yet another field that they used to dominate. I think this further illustrates how badly the labor redundancy argument fails to address the basic issues at hand, and lends further support to my own thesis, the idea that women in silent cinema, like female film editors in the 1940s and many other women in many other professions, both in and out of the film industry, were driven out, as Anne B. Coates explains, when men realized the spaces that they occupied enabled them to achieve great success and power. So where does that leave us? Well, It leaves us on the one hand with yet another narrative of a once female-dominated profession being abruptly supplanted by men once it was understood that that profession came with significant creative power and opportunities for success. The trajectory seems to be something like, oh, women can be directors because that's like sewing. Oh, wait, directors are powerful people in leadership positions who might earn lots of money and public acclaim? Oh, well, we were wrong. Directing isn't like sewing, it's a man's job. Editing is what's like sewing because it's out of view and not creative or empowering. What's that? Editing is at least as important as directing and sometimes comes with a deal of creative authority and control greater than that of directing? Whoops! We were wrong again. Editing is also a man's job. It's not like sewing at all. Who said that? What are you even talking about? So you can see this sort of, consistent thread, so to speak, in this narrative that we are filmically stitching together. Also, obviously, the fact that auteur theory has kind of hijacked our public discourse about film and its history and worked together with other patriarchal forces in our culture to erase women and their contributions from yet another aspect of international film history. But the video is almost over, Professor Saporin, and you haven't yet given us the second half of the hidden assignment, you say. Well, here it is right now. You must make another post on the Discussions tab of Web Campus discussing at least 3 of the film clips that we have screened here today. It can be any 3, but at least one of them must be in the avant-garde editing style. Ooh, you were watching all the way through and you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Of course you do. And what you think that these clips say, and what these clips in our discussion about them say about the history of female film editors and the ways that the surrounding culture has treated them. Due by midnight tonight, and again, I'll give extra credit to anyone who comments intelligently on another student's post. That's all for tonight, folks, but oh boy, as a little bonus, if you really wanted to see how badly the original Star Wars footage dragged before Marcia Lucas was brought on board, check out the link in the description, or that I will attach to the email just in case YouTube flags this too quickly, for George Lucas's original rough cut of the cantina scene, complete with the original voices of the British cast of extras at England's Pinewood Studios, not yet dubbed over with the American accents of the voice actors. Special note for Greedo fans. 2 suit actors played Greedo on 2 different days, and a women behind the camera fun fact, one of them was female. The female Greedo suit actor doesn't say any lines, however, I believe by her own choice, so as to keep her gender concealed from the other actors. I've read a little bit about her, and that was one of the things that she was very, very proud of, which is why there's a noticeably missing line in one of the shots when she was the person in the costume for one of the takes that they used. If you're nerdy like me and want to see how bad Star Wars almost was, I hope you enjoy. Till then, catch you on the flip side.
Party on, dudes!